Well, it is time for us to get started. We're in 2 Samuel 15. So we are still missing several of our number, but just remember the Warners as they're traveling in Indiana, visiting folks up there. I think Gail and Jenny are supposed to be back, Lord willing, on Saturday. Is that correct? So we are happy to hear that. We're thankful for that. We'll begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into our reading this evening. Righteous Heavenly Father, thank you for blessing us with our time together this evening to study from your word. We pray, Father, that you will be with us and bless us as we consider what happens to your servant David and the rebellion of his son Absalom. We pray, righteous Father, that you help us to discern your ways and help us, Father, to ever be faithful to you. It's in Jesus' name that we offer our prayer. Amen. All right, so we started talking about the first 6 verses on Sunday. Let's go ahead and read those again, and we'll wrap up what we had to say about that. 2 Samuel 15, the first 6 verses. After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And when he said, "Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel," Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." Then Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. All right, so we started talking on Sunday about what Absalom is doing here and how he very closely resembles a modern politician, just glad-handing and probably literally kissing babies. He's making himself out as a man of the people, right, which is like basically every modern politician who makes any kind of bid for office. I want us to pay attention to Absalom's speech and what his strategy is here. His speech is calculated to stir up grievances. And again, this is much like a modern politician. As Absalom is growing his support by convincing people that they ought to be laying more blame on other people for their problems. Right, so what he says to them is, "See, your claims are good and right." We'll have more to say about that in just a minute, but it's fairly obvious that he's buttering people up. Everybody who comes to him, he says, "See, your claims are good and right." So he's validating. Right? Your grievances are real. You're the good guy, Absalom is saying to these people. But there is no man designated by the king to hear you. So Absalom is laying blame specifically, not just on whoever this person has a case against, but he's laying the blame specifically on King David. And we noted on Sunday that he's basically invented a problem. All right, he says the king has not designated a man to hear you, which is honestly pretty silly. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because who is the man designated to hear these difficult cases that people are coming to Jerusalem for? It's David himself. It's the king's job to hear these cases and to render judgment on them. And we've seen David doing that. Right, with the case that Nathan brings to him and the case that the wise woman of Tekoa brings to him. We'll see it famously with Solomon and the case of the 2 prostitutes who come to him. And remember, they're both laying claim on the same child. And Solomon shows off his good judgment by tricking one of them into giving away that she's not really the mother. All right, well, we'll just split the difference. So Absalom is inventing a problem here, as if there is supposed to be another person designated by the king to hear these special cases. If there is, this is the first we've ever heard of it. Right? And so we get the sense that Absalom has invented this out of thin air to make people feel like they have some grievance, not just against their neighbor in whatever case they're bringing to Jerusalem to begin with, but they have a grievance specifically against the king. Now, here's the thing, though. Absalom is raising some of the same questions that we have been raising throughout the story. Namely, we've been questioning David's judgment over the course of this book. And there's a couple of lessons for us to learn from this. First off, when you question an authority's judgment, it's possible to do that in a couple of different ways. Right? When we're questioning David's judgment, it's because we're ultimately on his side. Right? Our questioning is a matter of discovering where an overall godly man fell short so that we can avoid similar errors ourselves and so that we can appreciate the grace of God in David's life. That's not what Absalom is doing. When Absalom calls David's judgment into question in this passage, it's because he's not on David's side. Absalom is questioning because he seeks to usurp David's place. Right? So in other words, when we come to the Scriptures and we point out this, that, or the other thing that is deficient with David, we're not doing that in the sense of saying, well, God shouldn't have left him king. Right? He has no business being on the throne. That is basically what Absalom is doing. He's not brought God into the question yet. But he is seeking to usurp David's place. And that's ultimately where this is all going, right? With all of his slick politicking, Absalom, we read, stole the hearts of the people. Or alternatively, you could read that as Absalom duped the men of Israel. So in the Hebrew Scriptures, the heart is also the seat of wisdom and the intellect. All right, so whenever it says that Absalom stole their hearts, it could mean that he's just very charismatic and everybody loves Absalom. The same way, by the way, well, similarly to how formerly we read that everybody loved David. Right? That was something that got under Saul's skin back in 1 Samuel 16, 17, and 18, where Saul keeps sending David out on these assignments, and David keeps doing really well, and everybody loves David. And Saul can't stand how much everybody loves David. That could be kind of the sense here, that Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel in that sense. Or it could also mean that with all of his slick talk, Absalom has duped all of the men of Israel. Now, before we move on from this, we should take a second to question David's judgment again, because the story is going to give us opportunity to. At this point, I think we should wonder at how Absalom is able to get away with so much so publicly. We don't get any kind of reaction from David out of any of this. But Absalom's not hiding this under a bushel. He's got a chariot and 50 runners. That causes kind of a commotion going through town, which he does every single morning as he goes from his house down to the gate where he can meet everybody who's coming in. So he's not subtle about this. And where he's spending his time at the city gates, it's one of the most public places in the city. And so for all of the times that we read, and it was told David, or David saw, we've got to wonder whether David was just oblivious to what's going on here, or whether he's burying his head in the sand. We have something similar going on with Absalom, like we had going on with Amnon, where we're left to wonder, well, why is David letting all of this go on? Right? Amnon rapes Tamar, and for a couple of years, seemingly nothing happens to him. And we're wondering, where's David? And now, here for a period of time, which we'll talk about how long in just a minute, Absalom is doing this thing where he runs around in a chariot with 50 runners ahead of him. And he spends all of his mornings at the city gate, very publicly making these declarations about how he's going to provide justice for everybody and how the king is not providing justice for anybody. He does this for a long time, and again, we are left to wonder, where's David in all of this? We're left to wonder whether Absalom's success belongs entirely to him, or whether David had exercised poor judgment with the people to the point that they were already somewhat dissatisfied with him. Now, whatever we think of David's judgment at this point, I think it's also important for us to understand that Absalom's judgment, quote unquote, is completely crooked. All right, look at what he's talking about, what he says out of one side of his face. All right, see, your claims are good and right, but there's no man designated by the king to hear you. Oh, that I were judge in the land, then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice. All right, that's just taken at face value. Oh, this sounds nice and pious. He's concerned about justice. And that's obviously a good thing, right? And we could point to all kinds of places in the Scripture where we would say, well, yeah, a person should be concerned with justice. But it should be obvious to us as readers, is Absalom actually concerned with justice in any of this? Is he really interested in making sure that the people who come to him receive the judgments that they are due and receive any kind of justice? Wayne, I see your hand.
Not to argue against you, but I think an alternative point we might want to make here is, as a politician, he is putting himself on the side of the people. He is supporting and doing what the people want. And I think that we have in our modern, I hate to bring up politics, but it's obvious to anybody that's ever been, listening to the radio or TV for the next 3 hours. It's very obvious. The Democrats tend to hone in on pleasing people. They become a very popular political party. Mm-hmm. And that's how they get their votes, is because they tell people what they want to hear. A lot of that, what they say, is what people want to hear. That's exactly what's going on here. He's being a good politician, telling people what they want to hear. He's victimizing, just like the Democrats do. They victimize. He is saying, you're right. You're the victim. The other guy's wrong. He ought to, you ought to get compensation for this. This is something everybody wants to hear. Yeah, I want more money. Mm-hmm. And so, and this is just right in that same line. And people they just flock to it. And they'll do it every single time.
Mm-hmm. And I'll add to that the GOP, again, not to get political, but it seems that I'll just say, in my estimation, it seems that the GOP has done its fair share of trying to catch up to that kind of playbook, where a lot of them are now explicitly brand themselves as populist, which is precisely what Absalom is doing. Right? Make himself out as a man of the people. Yes, and that brings us back to this question of justice, because Absalom says that he is for justice, when pretty clearly, what's Absalom actually for? Absalom is for Absalom. We could consider this. The standard for justice is declared in several places throughout the law. In fact, you could probably summarize it without looking. I'll just read from Deuteronomy 25, verse 1, that if there's a dispute between men and they come into court, the judge is supposed to decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. All right, and that's a standard for justice that like everybody instinctively understands, right? The law of Moses is not saying anything particularly profound in that verse. That the innocent should be acquitted, the guilty should be condemned, right? The people who are right should receive the benefit of a judgment, or the people who are in the wrong should receive the penalty for their being wrong. In other words, people should get what they deserve, more or less. That's right. There's supposed to be an attempt at justice. It's very much an easier said than done kind of thing. But we all understand the principle. This idea undergirds all law. But what is Absalom's standard? Well, what does he tell everyone whom he greets at the gate? Yeah. He says to everyone who comes to the gate. Yeah. Yeah. It says, see, your claims are good and right. Now, okay, that's what you were going to send. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's where we were going with this. Everybody who comes to him at the gate, he's got... Yeah, and are we really so credulous as to believe that Absalom has just had so many good cases come in front of him? He's just this rare judge who everybody who comes in front of him has a good case. What do you know? No, I mean, it's fairly obvious what Absalom is doing whenever he says, see, your claims are good and right. He's not really interested in justice or in law. It's much better to read him as, like we've been saying, a politician. That you can steal people's hearts by always telling them that they're right. Right, now, obviously that doesn't make them right, and it makes you wrong if that's the standard of justice that you have, that everybody who comes to you is always right. Tell people what they want to hear. And what people want to hear is you're the good guy. You're on the right side of things. It's all of your problems are everybody else's fault, right? It's we see so much of that kind of thing going on today too, right? Whose fault is it that the price of eggs is high? Well, it's immigrants or whatever. Ginger.
And just to build off that, I think another aspect of this is everyone's right, and also there's no solutions. So we get to continue to generate a lot of anger about how nothing's getting fixed. And, but it's them. It's that guy's problem. If you put me in charge, obviously everything would get fixed.
Right.
But then also his only plan is to put me in charge. He doesn't actually have any other methodology there.
If you were to import Absalom into 2023 America, you could practically hear him saying things like, this is the most important election of our lives. This is our last best chance to save America. Dennis?
And then the other thing is, not only do they not have a plan, but they don't really care.
Yeah.
They haven't bothered to designate anybody to hear complaints from your city, so they don't care about anybody but Jerusalem.
That's the you don't see anybody. You don't see Absalom offering any kind of there's no man designated by the king to hear you. Like, again, who says that it has to be the king making these kinds of designations, right? in Israel, there is supposed to be a fairly robust judiciary system, at least by ancient standards. Right? You've got people you can go to. You've got the elders of your clan. You've got the priests. You've got Levites who are scattered all throughout the land. Right? There are people that you can go to. Yeah, Absalom is his solution. It basically comes down to vote like your life depends on it. That kind of thing. And so he steals everyone's hearts. All right, so we'll see what comes of this. Any further questions or comments before we move on to the next passage? So I feel like we can have a lot of fun with Absalom on this, but this is going places. Let's read beginning in verse 7. And at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived at Geshur in Aram, saying, 'If the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord.' And the king said to him, 'Go in peace.' So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, 'As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron.' With Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo. And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing." All right, so right out of the gate, let's deal with verse 7. At the end of how many years Absalom went to King David with his request? It depends on what translation you're reading. If you're reading out of, you've heard me read out of the ESV. It says at the end of 4 years. Your translation, especially if you're reading, I think, the King James, possibly the New King James, might indicate that this goes on for 40 years instead of 4. And the reason for that is that the Masoretic text, as our Hebrew text, says 40. The Old Greek and the Syriac say 4. We've got a reason for preferring 4 over 40. We have a really good, solid biblical reason for it. How long is David's entire reign? 40 years. But 40 years is just impossible. David has already been king in Jerusalem for several years at this point. He has more of his reign to go after Absalom's rebellion. This bit where Absalom is planning his rebellion cannot itself last as long as David's entire reign. And in Hebrew, the difference between 4 and 40 is not very big. So it's probably a scribal error on the part of the Masoretic text. So, plus, at the end of the story, David is going to refer to Absalom as a young man. Again, the Old Greek and the Syriac, I think, are to be preferred in this case. So, that textual issue aside, we can get back to the story itself. Absalom comes to King David, and he says that he wants to go to Hebron to pay a vow that he has made to the Lord. And we could note, of course, Absalom's perversity in making this particular kind of lie. He's not just going to Hebron to fulfill a vow. He's going to Hebron to have himself coronated king there and to begin a rebellion against his father. And to get himself to Hebron, he lies about making sacrifices to the Lord. This is the kind of stuff that we have seen out of other people earlier in the book. Taking advantage of the Lord's worship in a perverse way like this. we should also note that once again, David has been duped by a request. And notice it keeps happening now, where one of David's kids will come to him with a request, and they'll just flat up lie to him. And he never really questions or anything. So we saw it with Amnon getting Tamar in his clutches. We saw it with Absalom getting Amnon in his clutches. And now we see it again with Absalom going to Hebron, where he can be crowned king. He might be taking advantage of David's own piety with this request. His request is the kind of thing that we might expect David himself to do. Right? David would genuinely want to go to Hebron to pay a vow. But it's kind of a mixed scene, right? We can say that David has been duped. At the same time, it highlights what makes David admirable. That he's the sort of person who truly acknowledges whenever the Lord delivers him, right? You just look at the Psalms. Absalom is using this sacrifice as a pretense. And this kind of abuse of the sacrifice reminds us of Saul. So Absalom goes to Hebron, and we're in 2 Samuel 15. Absalom goes to Hebron, and you might recall what makes Hebron so special. That was David's capital before he took Jerusalem. Because remember, there's a period of time where David is king over Judah, while Ishbosheth is king over Israel. I think it's 7 years, if I remember correctly. And during those 7 years, David lives at Hebron. It's David's own stronghold for the beginning of his kingship. And Absalom chooses that place to coronate himself. So Absalom is sending a strong message through his actions that he is coming for David. And in fact, that he is a king after David. Right? That he's starting his kingship the same way that David started his. And he's also flexing. Right? He's going where we would expect loyalty for David to be strong. And yet, we find that Absalom's sacrifice and coronation go off just fine. In fact, it goes off so well that, first off, he has called out all Israel to his coronation. He's sent these secret messengers out, apparently to try to spread the message throughout all the tribes of Israel, but keep it a secret from his father, we suppose. But he's able to do that and gets broad support from it. And furthermore, he's able to take along 200 men from Jerusalem as invited guests. They don't know what they're getting into, but at the same time, we don't hear any objections from them, right? They've shown up to an event that they weren't expecting, and they, at least by their silence, seem to be okay with it. The Absalom is able to coronate himself in Hebron without any problems at all. And it seems that he's able to do all of this because, again, he's just spent the past 4 years meeting people from all over Israel. Remember, he asks them, whenever they come to the gate, tell me, what city are you from? And you suspect that maybe Absalom has been keeping tabs in his head or has been keeping some kind of running count. All right, have I met enough people from Zebulun? All right, have I met enough people from Naphtali? Have I met enough people from Dan and from Manasseh and Benjamin and Asher and Gad? And eventually he hits this point where he thinks, all right, I've talked to enough people from all over Israel. Now's the time. Now I can call people from all Israel and anoint myself king in Hebron. All right. Like I said, we'll have more to say about these 200 men from Jerusalem in just a minute. But we also get a note about an important character that we're meeting for the first time here. Just a short little note in verse 12, While Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo. And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. And it's not said explicitly here, it's implied pretty strongly, and it's going to be told to us explicitly in just a couple of passages. But Ahithophel defects over to Absalom's side. Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, he goes over to Absalom's side. And at this point in the story, the text doesn't draw this connection for us. But it's not uncommon for commentators to start connecting some dots in Samuel concerning this man Ahithophel, because this is not the only place that we read his name. Towards the end of the book, in 2 Samuel 23, verse 34, it's in the middle of a list of David's mighty men, and we read that one of them was Eliam, the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite. And so this seems to be the same Ahithophel, because he's identified as Ahithophel the Gilonite. So Ahithophel from the city of Gila, or Gilo, rather. So not only was Ahithophel David's counselor, but he was also the father of one of David's mighty men. So what would cause him to defect to Absalom's side? Well, from there, we can turn to 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 3. Now remember, we just read in 23:34 that Ahithophel's son is named Eliam. Eliam is the name of that mighty man in David's cohort. In 2 Samuel 11, verse 3, of course, we remember what's going on in 2 Samuel 11. David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" All right, so Bathsheba's father is named Eliam. Now, I personally am a little ambivalent about this, and I'm not the only one, because Eliam is a pretty... I'm going to say it's a common name, not in the sense that we read about it a whole lot in the Old Testament. We don't read that name very often in the Old Testament. But the name itself, it basically just means God of my people, or God of my country. Like, it's a pretty common sort of name as far as Hebrew names go. Kind of like how, Joshua is a common name, because it means salvation comes from the Lord. It's the kind of name that lots of people in Israel have. So the text doesn't draw this connection for us. It does not tell us, all right, Bathsheba's father, Eliam, is the same Eliam who was one of David's mighty men, and his father, Bathsheba's grandfather, is Ahithophel, David's counselor. It doesn't ever lay that out explicitly for us. But it's possible. Some people think it's highly likely that is the way that all of these relations work, that it is the same Eliam that we're talking about in those two chapters. Therefore, the defection of Ahithophel, well, we would have a much easier explanation for it then. Why does Ahithophel defect from David to Absalom's side? Well, because David raped his granddaughter and murdered his grandson-in-law. Again, the text doesn't draw those connections for us, but I thought I would bring that out because it is something that is pretty commonly brought out. So the main thing, though, is to focus on that Ahithophel has defected over to Absalom's side, and this is not the last that we're going to see of him. And at the end of that verse, we get a really ominous note. The conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. It reminds us of the transition at the beginning of 2 Samuel between Saul's kingdom and David's kingdom. how we read in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. Of course, at that point, we know that signals David's house is on the ascent, Saul's house is waning and is on its way out, and it's right before David is anointed king over all Israel. And so this little description here at the end of verse 12, that the people with Absalom kept increasing, should make us wonder, are we about to watch that same kind of thing again, except with Absalom growing stronger and stronger, and David growing weaker and weaker? That's what it's going to look like for at least a little bit here in the story. And we're going to be left with the image of David becoming like Saul in some ways, that his kingdom is at risk on account of his own sins and shortcomings. Now, Absalom, on the other hand, is acting as a usurper, which, and we've said plenty about this, it's a temptation that David himself had, but overcame whenever he was dealing with Saul. So again, it's like we're hearing some of the same stories retold, just everybody's making the wrong choices instead of making the right choices. All right, any questions or comments about that passage before we move on to the next one? All right, verse 13. And a messenger came to David, saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom." Then David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly, and bring down ruin on us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword." And the king's servants said to the king, "Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king decides." So the king went out, and all his household after him. And the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. And the king went out, and all the people after him, and they halted at the last house. All right, so whenever David hears what has happened, he makes the immediate decision to flee. All right, he understands that Absalom has become very popular. This might make sense of those 200 Jerusalemites that Absalom brought as guests with him to Hebron. The fact that he had 200 men of Jerusalem attend his coronation might be a factor in David's haste to flee from the city. 200 is a fairly large number, even for a city of Jerusalem's size in those days. That could represent a significant chunk of the important people of Jerusalem. So David might have reason to fear that he's not going to stand a chance against Absalom. So what we're about to watch over the next few passages is this departure from Jerusalem is going to occur in stages. So first, as we've read just in verse 17, we see David go to the outskirts of the city, to the last house. And then he's going to go to the natural boundary of the city, which is the brook Kidron. Then he's going to ascend the Mount of Olives in a short but I think really significant scene. And then eventually he's going to go to a place that they refer to as the Fords of the Wilderness, which is very likely a reference to the River Jordan. So that tends to be the boundary marker between the Promised Land and the wilderness. All right, when Israel crosses the Jordan, that's when they're entering the Promised Land. That's when they're leaving the wilderness, at least under Joshua. Well, now David is going back to the fords of the wilderness and eventually is even going to cross over the fords of the wilderness for a brief time. So David is going to be, well, I mean, we think about this. It should be fairly obvious to us what's significant about David fleeing all the way out to the fords of the wilderness and then eventually crossing the fords of the wilderness, in that it's a reversal of Israel's own crossing out of the wilderness and into the Promised Land, particularly the crossing of the Jordan in the book of Joshua. And this section of the book is going to use a lot of the same language as the Jordan crossing in the book of Joshua. And again, it's as if the house of David were at risk of losing the whole promised land. And this all, again, goes back to David's sin. This all directly comes out of what David did. It's bound up explicitly in what Nathan tells David in 2 Samuel 12. That evil is going to arise out of his own house, right? That a sword is going to come after him. All of those things that Nathan said in chapter 12, they are coming about now in this part of the book. Now, for later readers of this story, particularly the exiles in Babylon, this journey, I think, is going to be especially important. Because as they are hearing this story retold in Babylon, right, they're going to hear that even King David was forced out of the promised land into exile. And the way that David's story ends up is going to be, it's going to give the exiles a hopeful ending to look forward to for themselves. David's going to leave, but he's not going to be gone forever. He is going to come back. He's not going to lose the promised land, and he's not going to lose the throne. He is going to come back and reestablish his reign. And we should also note, by the way, in talking about the exile, the nature of David's departure that happens in stages where he goes to the edge of the city, he goes to the brook Kidron, the Mount of Olives, then to the fords of the wilderness, and then beyond. That's going to be echoed in the Spirit's departure from the land as seen by the prophet Ezekiel, where the Spirit is going to come up out of the holy place and is going to rest over the threshold of the temple, and then is going to move out over Jerusalem, and then is going to move to the east of Jerusalem, and then eventually is just going to leave. And Ezekiel is going to witness God physically leaving Israel. And it's we'll hear echoes of David's own departure in that. All right, so we're pretty much at the end of our time here. I tell you, I think we've got room for one more passage. This is a short one. Let's start in verse 18. All right, so along the way, David is going to meet a series of his servants, and we'll read of the first of them in this passage. And all his servants passed by him, and all the Kerethites and all the Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath, passed on before the king. Then the king said to Ittai the Gittite, "Why do you also go with us? Go back and stay with the king, for you are a foreigner, and also an exile from your home. You came only yesterday, and shall I today make you wander about with us, since I go I know not where? Go back and take your brothers with you, and may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you." But Ittai answered the king, "As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be." And David said to Ittai, "Go then, pass on." So Ittai the Gittite passed on with all his men and all the little ones who were with him. And all the land wept aloud as all the people passed by. And the king crossed the brook Kidron, and all the people passed on towards the wilderness. All right, so even at this early stage, everything is pointing towards the wilderness. David leaving the promised land. All right, so in this first stage, as he's leaving the city of Jerusalem, David comes across some of his foreign contingent, Kerethites, Pelethites, and 600 Gittites. And specifically, he comes across who we suppose is the commander of the Gittites, this guy named Ittai. Ittai the Gittite. And that sounds just as funny in Hebrew as it does in English, right? Ittai the Gittite. I think it even sounds funnier in Hebrew, kind of sing-songy. Ittai the Gittite. There's a reason for that. There's some wordplay going on with the name Ittai, which sounds a whole lot like the Hebrew word for with, which could be Ito or even Ittai. because Ittai is going to remain loyal to the king and stay with him. And it's kind of signified rhymingly through his name, Ittai. Ittai's loyalty is despite the fact that he's not an Israelite, or he's a Gittite, a man of Gath, that is a Philistine. And I think there's some New Testament foreshadowing here that the king of Israel, and we're going to be taking a lot of gospel cues from this particular story. The king of Israel is betrayed by members of his own nation and his own household, whereas those who remain loyal to him include Gentiles, such as Ittai. We're going to have more to make of that in the coming passages. But once we get to the Gospels and we hear the sorts of things that happen to Jesus, we're supposed to hear echoes of this departure from Jerusalem, when David is betrayed by his own house, by the nation of Israel, and is forced to flee and has Gentiles following after him. All right, we're out of time. Any final questions or comments before we close up tonight? All right, thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments this evening. Lord willing, we'll pick up in verse 24 on Sunday.